So, hey, y'all, I am so delighted and thrilled to be introducing you to Joseph Selbie. I first encountered him a couple years back because of one of his books, The Yugas, Keys to Understanding Our Hidden Past, Emerging Energy Age, and Enlightened Future. And this is one of those books that hit me so hard I've actually reread it a couple times, including just a week or two ago. I went and reread it yet again. I've read a couple of his other books as well. I'm reading The Physics of God. But Joseph Selbie is an author, a speaker. He's worked all over, including with the Chopra Center. He has helped found Ananda, which is a vibrant yoga community, meditation community, based a lot on the teachings of Paramahamsa Yogananda, but he also has a background in science. So he really approaches things from a really beautiful, multidimensional way. His book on the Yugas talks about this idea of the cyclical nature of humanity, that we tend to think of human evolution as being a very linear progression, that we went from Stone Age hunters and gatherers to farmers to then the Sumerians, the Greeks, the Renaissance, modern man. But archaeology suggests that perhaps isn't actually the way things have gone. There is much evidence of cultures before our current reckoning that had technology that is beyond the scope of our current understanding. Their ability to manufacture and build items that we frankly don't know how they were made, whether they were temple complexes buried under the earth intentionally, or stoneware pottery that is so perfect modern stonemasons can't figure out how it's created, or even a floor buried in Oklahoma that may have been dated back far before humans were supposedly creating even anything. This idea that we have risen and fallen as a society, and not just in our technology and our way of living, but in ourselves, in our consciousness, in our connection to the divine, to spirit, and that we will be returning to a more enlightened age soon, and that we have been in a more enlightened age in years past, and it is our future, our destiny, and also our past. So I couldn't be more delighted and thrilled to have you here today. Thank you so much for taking time out of your busy schedule to share some thoughts and wisdom with us. I just really believe that people would love getting to hear about your perspectives straight from you. So the floor is yours. Do with it what you will.
First, let me say thanks for having me and letting me talk about this favorite subject of mine. The Yugas have been around, according to the Vedic scriptures, they've been around as long as 7,000 or 8,000 years. And that's just what can be dated as far as that knowledge goes. Since this is a theory of cyclic human development, it could have been known for millions of years and then gets lost and refound, lost and refound. But it's really very ancient knowledge. Interestingly, every ancient culture on the earth has some version of the Yuga, has some version of a cyclic kind of history, or if not cyclic per se, it at least has the concept that there were higher ages in the past. The one that we're likely most familiar with in the West is the Greek concept of there having been golden age in the distant past, that then devolved to a silver age, still a very high age, and then devolved again into the bronze age and finally into the iron age, which was when this cycle was being sort of codified and included in the culture. They thought they were in that lowermost age. But it's also found in China, found in Norse myths. It's found even in North American Indian myths. There are echoes of it in the Mayan myths and in the Mayan calendar. So it's not just this one theory that comes out of India that we're talking about. Really, we're talking about a tradition that was apparently all over the world, and tend to think that it was more than a tradition. It was reality that people knew and understood and experienced many, many thousands of years ago and then passed on to the people coming after them. That is, in a nutshell, refer to a 24,000 year repeating cycle. And the cycle is more like the waxing and waning of the moon than it is like only a circle. According to modern dating of the Yugas, the last peak of the cycle was 11,500 BC. And then from 11,500 BC, it gradually devolved through very similar ages as we talk about in the Greek understanding of gold, silver, bronze, and iron. But in the theory of the Yugas, they have another dimension to it, which you alluded to in your introduction, which is not only were these ages higher, better, and nicer, they also were that because mankind as a whole had a higher level of consciousness. So in the Yugas, the two go together. There's a cycle of high consciousness to low and back again to high consciousness. And then there is the nature of the civilizations that exist in those various periods of higher and lower consciousness. So the Yugas, like the Greeks, are broken into four. There's the Satya Yuga, which is the highest age, Treta Yuga, which corresponds to the Silver Age of the Greeks, Dwapara Yuga, which corresponds to the Bronze Age, and finally Kali Yuga, which corresponds to Iron Age, or the lowest age. So when the cycle begins to return to highest age, it goes back up through the ages. It doesn't just go from the lowest and then to the highest again and down and back to the highest and down. That's why it's more like waxing and waning of the moon. So if you think of the highest age as the full moon and the lowest age as the new moon, as the ages begin to go back towards higher consciousness, they gradually increase, just like the moon gradually increases towards full again. So this waxing of high level of consciousness and waning down to low consciousness is, according to the Yugas, a cycle that has repeated itself every 24,000 years for what's likely to be millions of years. Nobody knows. The proponents of that cycle, who I follow, Yogananda and Sri, hint that is it indeed millions of years that this cycle has repeated itself. So where we are today on the cycle, which usually people immediately want to know, is we're on the upswing again, that the nadir of Kali Yuga, the Iron Age, was at 500 AD. And then from 500 AD, it began to go up, still in a fairly low age. But in 1700, we went into this next higher age, Dwapara Yuga. And each age is marked with a particular quality, a particular awareness that mankind has. So in the lowest age, Sri Yukteswar said mankind as a whole, which indicates that there are some people who have higher knowledge even in the low ages, but mankind as a whole pretty much only comprehended, only really understood the physical world around them that could be perceived by the senses. And so this age was really marked by people power, animal power, wind power, to some degree water power, all very kind of physical uses of what was available to do work. And the consciousness was very low. What we think of as recorded history, which started roughly BC, pretty much corresponds to the beginning of the lowest age of Kali Yuga, of this material consciousness, which is unfortunate because historians assume that this is where man came from, right? That we evolved in this straight line Darwinian mode. And if the Dark Ages, as they're referred to in modern history, our modern view of history, if the Dark Ages were only like 2,000 years ago, and whatever came before it was really dark, was really awful. It was, hunter-gatherers with pretty much no communication skills, and they were chucking spears at mastodons, etc. That's the narrative of archaeology. That's the narrative of not only archaeology, but prehistorians and historians. But there's a lot of evidence that indicates man was much more able to accomplish things in what is easiest to refer to as the descending Dwapara, or the descending Yuga, or even the descending Satya Yuga that came before us. The Yugas do a great job of explaining why, but these anomalies that are seen, like the Great Pyramid and the incredible accuracy and complexity of the Sanskrit language, and Göbekli Tepe, which you were referring to as a temple complex that was built almost 12,000 years ago. None of those fit in this hunter-gatherer to modern man straight line Darwinian picture. But the Yugas offer a solution to that. So I started by saying that Kali Yuga was the material age. The next age up is the energy age. And Sriak described this as being the time in which mankind as a whole would be aware that matter is really made of energy, and that mankind as a whole would also be aware they have subtle energy. Life force is the way we think of it today. And we can see those both predictions coming out in our modern times. So at the turn of the 20th century, roughly 1900, we had the breakthrough discoveries in physics, most famously by Einstein and his theory of special relativity, which most people know from the equation E equals mc squared, which is basically a very elegant, condensed way to say that matter is energy. So E is energy equals m, which is matter, times the speed of light squared. That's how much energy is contained in matter. The physics of it, the exploitation of it, is achieved through those kind of equations. But the fundamental meaning of it is that we're living in a time when our science and many people understand that matter is an illusion. Matter is condensed. But when you go into the experiments of the particle colliders, like the Large Hadron Collider in CERN, when they break atoms apart into finer and finer bits, there are no bits. What they are really breaking it down into is different types of vibrating energy that tend to behave as particles. But no matter how fine you go, you never find any enduring little ball of solidity. It's all energy interacting with energy. So that's one level of understanding the energy age, which we're in now. But the other is we're getting in touch slowly with the fact that each one of us is made of energy, and that each one of us has awareness of, or the potential awareness of, the subtle energy within our own bodies. And that subtle energy is generally referred to as life force. We see as a basis of much of alternative healing being the manipulation of life force, the manipulation of subtle energy. We see that in acupuncture, we see that in chiropractic, and numerous other practices. It's interesting to see the parallels between our current ascending Dwapara energy age and what was known in descending Dwapara. It's difficult to visualize this 24,000 year cycle, but one of the ways I do it for people is to imagine that it's a clock face. So roughly, descending Dwapara was right around 20 past to 25 past the hour. And Dwapara is right around 35 past the hour up to about 40. So you could draw a straight line if you were looking at that clock face, right? You could draw a straight line from the relative position to hour number 6 of descending Dwapara on the one hand and ascending Dwapara on the other. According to the theory of the Yugas, according to the concept of the Yugas, is that you should find similar understanding. You should find a similar level of consciousness in descending as you do. So if we look back to descending Dwapara and we look into their healing, we find it's all alternative healing. But also mixed into it is an extraordinary amount of knowledge that theoretically couldn't possibly exist of anatomy and physiology. In ancient Egypt, they did C-sections. They knew about cerebrospinal fluid. They knew about musculature in the body. But they also knew, which is what they knew then and we're rediscovering now, is that we have this inner energy system. We have chakras, we have meridians. And if you can work directly with them, you can effect healing often more effectively than by herbs or other forms of medicine that were practiced back then. So it's fascinating to me that chiropractic is something that has emerged in the West, which has to do with manipulating the spine to free up blocked life force so that by doing so, you improve your overall health when life force is flowing freely through the body. Acupuncture, on the other hand, which is very, very similar principle, it wasn't born 200 years ago. It was born about 2500 BC. There are acupuncture needles discovered in China made of bone, I think, really, really fine needles that indicate acupuncture was practiced that long ago. So you can see these parallels between Dwapara as we're experiencing it today and Dwapara as it was experienced then. If we go up to try to understand the yet higher level, in the case of descending Treta Yuga, it preceded descending Dwapara, and Treta is another 2,000 years plus ahead of us. But in Treta Yuga, it said that mankind as a whole would have more mental powers, and that one of which would be that most people would communicate, but it would also give people tremendous powers of visualization and manifestation, that you could do directly things that would appear to be miracles today, and that you could affect the world around you, you could affect other people by the powers of your mind. And if we look into the past and try to look for connections to that, one of the ways in which you see it are the ancient epics like the Ramayana, the journeys of Gilgamesh in Mesopotamia. There's a similar kind of history story in China where you have these today, what we would think of as larger than life heroes who go out on these quests and encounter really powerful opponents, and they defeat them using advanced mental weapons or with advanced kind of prowess. And in fact, the Greeks often also referred to the Silver Age, which corresponds to as the age of the heroes. So that kind of understanding of the nature of consciousness in those times very similarly reflected. And then the last age, the Satya Yuga, is the highest age where mankind as a whole not only has energy, life force awareness, not only mental awareness and powers, but also an awareness of spirit, an awareness of the consciousness of God, the awareness of spirit creating all things, creating the world, creating everyone's bodies and consciousness. So a very, very high age. And as you might expect, the lore that comes to us from that age, coming down through various traditions, is that people could work miracles. They could levitate. They could basically fly because they had that consciousness. And as you would also guess, it was golden age. It was a time of unprecedented peace, of unprecedented bounty, of love between people and love with God. It was paradise. Although we can't see over our time horizon going forward, those higher ages of Treta and Yuga and Satya Yuga are what we can expect to come mankind's way in another 2,000 to get into Treta and another about 6,000 to get into. So that's the big picture of the yugas and the basic descriptions of the consciousness in each yuga and basically where we are in our particular cycle. So let me toss it back to you so I don't stay in lecture mode for any longer than necessary. So what would you like to know, or what do you find fascinating?
Well, first off, thank you for laying all that out so eloquently. I really appreciate it. I think it's a really beautiful and heartening idea, especially in today's chaotic and often feeling very troubled world, that we're heading in an ascendiary direction, that we are moving towards a place of greater oneness, greater bliss, greater unification, greater God consciousness. Because I think a lot of people look around the world and say, it is so chaotic. There's so much war. There's so much frustration. In fact, and this is something you bring up in your book, when I first encountered the idea of this cyclical nature of human experience, the Yugas, I learned it while being part of a yogic tradition that said we were still in Kali Yuga, that we were still in the bottom rung. And there's plenty of people in India today who believe that we are still living in the most desolate, dark of times. I remember shortly after I encountered that idea, it started to not make sense to me, because I thought, well, actually things are on the whole much better than they used to be. You go back to 500 AD and there was no education, there was no travel. You basically were born, lived, and died in the same village, most likely. You probably had no access to healthcare or good food even, compared to now where you have a toilet, you have indoor plumbing, you've got healthcare, hopefully. Like, things have improved dramatically. And you just look at how our society, our global society, has leveled up with fewer people being in poverty, more people having access to water and sanitation. It is a marked difference. And before I encountered your book, I remember thinking, I wonder if we are in Dwapara Yuga. I wonder if we are in that second phase. And when I read your book, it very much convinced me that I think that's the right perspective. But I think one of the things that people need to realize is even though in the long term things are going to continue to get better and better, it doesn't mean we aren't going to be experiencing conflict. That doesn't mean that we aren't going to be experiencing war, or even perhaps even world-changing events. In the book, you talk about the fact that our society, our global society, will be decreasing tremendously in the coming centuries. And science says the same thing. They said in the not too distant future, our global population may be decreasing. So can you just speak a little bit on that idea of just because we are on an upward trajectory doesn't mean that life is suddenly going to become perfect for everyone on the planet in the next 50 years or the next 100 years?
Yes, and I think that I've run into this question many times, and it is often a reason why people find the Yugas hard to believe. It doesn't seem like things are getting better, and quite the contrary. It often seems to people that things are getting worse and that we're heading for worldwide destruction, or you name it. The seas are going to rise up and cover us all up, and things are going to be significantly worse than they are now. And I can understand that perspective. But on the other hand, if you go back to just 100, which is when Sri Yukteswar said we had really entered Dwapara Yuga, between 1700 and 1900, we were technically in what he called a transition period, or a twilight and dawn kind of transition period. But by the time 1900 arrived, we were in Dwapara proper. So societally, if you look back to the beginning of 1900 and think about women's rights, they were non-existent. Women were still considered chattel in most parts of the world, and even in America, which was relatively enlightened for its time. Race was horrible. I mean, blacks in America were barely out of slavery and still almost viewed that way. There were lynchings. People could just hang someone. They could just basically murder someone publicly and have no consequences. And I don't have to tell you about, there's nothing like gay rights. And there was persecution for a very long time, still is. But compared to 1900, it's a breath of fresh air. But there's a long way to go. We also know that. These are societal rights that are still, in many cases, honored in the breach. But if you compare them black and white, or dark gray to lighter gray, however you want to think of that, we've seen a lot of improvement in 120 years. We've also seen world wars. We've also seen the advent of nuclear energy, dropping of nuclear bombs. We've seen war seemingly forever. I think there was some statistic that there's been like 1 year out of the last 120 years where there wasn't a substantial war somewhere on the planet. But even that, and this may sound like, what would you call it, like a left-handed argument. There's actually fewer people dying in those wars, but there is a greater concern over loss of human life, and there's more protection for soldiers who are fighting in those battles. So it's a left-handed argument that there's improvement, but it is true. And of course, you look at things like medicine, the life expectancy has doubled since the turn of the century. All that said, we're still in a fairly material world. We still are a society where self-interest is king, and you can multiply that self-interest from one person to all the people in a group, and they have group interest and all the people in that group, and you end up with nations with self-interest, and there's a lot of conflict, and there probably will continue to be a lot of conflict because it could be hundreds of years before that kind of raw self-interest begins to change into enlightened self-interest, which is, a concept with which we're familiar today. But essentially, enlightened self-interest says, well, I'm not going to use all the power I have or have the opportunity I have to make your life less good than mine, because gradually people will begin to understand that when your life is better, my life is better. That when there's peace in the world, my life is better. But we're a ways away from that. But I do believe with enough time, and going back to 1900, you're going to be able to see that actual improvement more clearly than if you just go back to 2000. 2000 to today, it'd be harder to say, oh, it was much worse or much better. But if you go back to 1800, if you go back to 1700, it's dramatic how much better it is now for us. It's just not perfect by any stretch.
But one of the things you bring up so eloquently in the book is this idea that just because society as a whole is in one particular phase of development, each individual has the opportunity to align themselves with a consciousness from any level of human ability. So you have people who will be at lower levels of consciousness. Unfortunately, some of them might be in our government. We have people at higher levels of awareness. And you see them in the great teachers and sages and saints and soulful beings who make the world a better place. And so as we do our own work, even though societally we're not resonating at that higher level, we can experience a golden age of our own, per se. And that we can find others who are resonating in such a way. You brought up the idea of flying. It's a story that we see in many cultures of humans having had the ability to fly. And in your book, you talk about this Catholic saint. Did he end up getting sainted, or was he just
Saint Joseph of Cupertino?
Yes, yeah. who was witnessed by hundreds or thousands of people as being able to fly. So who knows what we are fully capable of as humans, but that we can do our own inner work to try and align ourselves with those more advanced qualities that you've described.
And if you're speaking purely in the spiritual equation of growth, we're often a situation that isn't a wonderful situation to be in, but it's a perfect situation for us to grow, is what we need to be challenged by in order to really manifest our spiritual understanding and our spiritual awareness, rather than have a world around us that's just so nice that we don't have to work, that it's too easy. So it can be a great blessing living now. I feel personally that it's a great blessing for me to be living at this time. But as you say, the broader societals for spirituality, alternative healing, meditation, etc., in the main is not a lot. You consider we've got approaching 8 billion people on the planet. There may be 200 or 300 million of us who are embracing the more subtle energy approach to finding happiness and health. But it's growing dramatically. And it also, because we're working with subtle energy and raising our consciousness, we're raising the consciousness of mankind ourselves by channeling that higher consciousness. It's spreading out in the way that subtle energy is, which is non-local, entangled. Distance has no meaning. Space has no meaning. When you and I are exchanging energy here, it's happening instantaneously with you and with me. And then it's radiating from both of us out into the rest of the world. And it's much more powerful than is noticeable, because it takes a long time for that consciousness to raise the consciousness of those other 7,700,000,000 people, right? But it is happening. We see some amazing statistics that in pretty much in my lifetime, I'm 70 something, we went from nobody ever having heard of yoga or acupuncture. Chiropractic was there already, but they were really considered to be quacks, and they were not given much validity. No one virtually had heard of meditation. And as I say, in those 70 years of my lifetime, meditation's mainstream. Yoga postures are mainstream. Acupuncture is mainstream. So it's mushrooming rather than just growing linearly. And it's going to be us who transform the age by the continuing expansion of the kind of awareness that we're having and the kind of practices that we practice. That is going to mushroom out into society and gradually bring about that time of enlightened self-interest and greater awareness of using energy for your own benefit, using subtle energy for your own benefit. So it's a small and hardy bunch of us, relatively speaking, right now, but it's going to grow inevitably.
I think is really interesting too is not just society as a whole, because you're absolutely right, how things have changed over the last century regarding the acceptability of those things and the prevalence of those things. It has ballooned. But what I think is even fascinating is how we've recently started to see it slip into even more traditionally reserved spaces where that stuff would have been considered like too fluffy, too out there. A friend of mine is an executive coach for really big companies, and one of the things he was commenting on is not that many years ago, it was like a big thing for people in leadership roles at major corporations to have their own wellness coach or their own private coach. But now these same people are openly admitting to have their own shamans or their own meditation teachers or their own spiritual guides in a way that would have got you laughed at and probably fired from your job had you been open about any of that sort of curiosity, even a decade or two ago.
Yeah, that was somewhat of a shock to people when Ronald Reagan's wife admitted that she consulted an astrologer all the time so that her husband Ronald would speak on the most auspicious days, etc. And that kind of blew people's minds that here was somebody actually embracing this wild science. And that was in the
80s, yeah. And now no one would blink if you opened a very expensive office building and said, well, I'm having my feng shui person or my vastu person come in to check the layout before things officially kick off.
I would say, oh, cool. I wonder if I can work there.
Exactly. One of the things you bring up in the book when we talk about this progression, you make a parallel to the changing of the seasons, that it's a slow ebbing and flowing. It's like the moon. And we talk about how it is tied to the progression through the zodiac, that over approximately, I think you said 26,000 years, the Earth progresses through the zodiac, and that will eventually end back where we are. The question that kind of comes to mind for me as we bring up this idea of planetary movement, not just around the sun, but through space itself, and that perhaps providing this 24,000-year cycle. Yukateshwar brings up the idea of the dual, or that there's this other planet or celestial body that we're in rotation with. To me, that suggests that when we're in closer proximity or on the opposite side of this transit, we are closer to that consciousness, that it permeates the earth, that we are all more enlightened, we are all more perceptive of God energy, that we are co-creators of this reality. If our evolution and de-evolution on a spiritual level can be tied to proximity to this other celestial body, this dual, does that somehow imply a directionality from where consciousness comes from, where quote unquote God exists, that if we can be closer or further from it, that it affects us to that degree? What are your thoughts?
There's very little to go on in what Sri Yukteswar explicitly stated about the cause of this cycle and why it rotates. And as you say, he mentioned that the solar system rotates around dual. He never defined very exactly what the dual was. Since that time, those of us who are way into his picture of the yugas have tried to figure out what that could be and have looked for stars that we might have this kind of 24,000 year do-si-do with. And there really aren't any candidates yet. And that has made more of us think perhaps it's a more subtle relationship to something than literally moving through space and rotating around another star. A brown dwarf is often postulated as a possibility because we wouldn't be able to see it. You know, it might be out there, we might be doing this dance, but it's never been discovered because seeing a brown dwarf at, tens of thousands of light years away is practically impossible. But the other way to potentially answer the question is to look at that connection that Treta made between the precession of the zodiac, the precession of the equinoxes, and the wobble of the earth. It has an axis through the middle, and that axis pretty much remains exactly in the same angular position the whole time we go around the sun. But that's only because we only see 1 year of it. And in fact, over the 26,000 years of the precession, that angle actually describes a kind of a circle. And that what it means is that the pole of the earth relative to the sun actually points towards it and away from it. Now, if it were the sun that was the source of this influence that makes the yugas happen, it would be a much shorter period. So we're looking for something that could be 24,000, 26,000 years in that rotation of the pole. And there really is not a good candidate for that unless you make a leap. And I like to make the leap because I've made this leap in many other areas of how I think about reality, is to ask the question, what if the dual is non-local? What if the dual is a relationship we have with something that isn't a physical object, but is a pure energy object, and that we have this connection to it, and it's part of what makes our earth wobble occur? So I don't want to get way into it because I don't even understand it to the degree that I have friends who have gotten into it. But the notion, I like this notion because I can compare that earth wobble to how a crystal radio works. Now, you may never have heard of a crystal radio because you're younger than I am. And they didn't even really exist when I was a youngster, but I knew about them. One of the things I did in Cub Scouts was I built my own crystal radio. And all radios were crystal to begin with. And what they had discovered was that by running electricity through a crystal and then physically moving the crystal, you could pick up radio signals. And that crystal actually resonated at different frequencies depending on where it was oriented. So my theory is that this motion, this slow change of the polar angle of the Earth over that 26,000 years tunes us to some station, some high energy, subtle energy station out there that transforms the earth, not just the mind and soul of people, but transforms the earth and brings it up to a higher vibratory rate. And so if we incarnate on the earth when it's in Satya Yuga, we're born with a body and nervous system that is already vibrating at a very high vibratory rate, which makes it natural for us to be able to tune into spirit. And when we're born into a body in Kali Yuga, the vibratory rate of that body is very low, relatively speaking, and makes us dull and unable to perceive much at all beyond what we can perceive through the senses. The precession of the equinox, which is caused by this wobble, puts the entire Earth into attunement to some source coming from outside the solar system that raises the energy level, the subtle frequency of the Earth completely, and makes each person more able or less able to connect to spirit. So it isn't spirit itself that causes this shift of consciousness, but because in any age, as you already eloquently explained, in any age, you can achieve with spirit yourself. There's nothing to prevent you from doing it, but you have to do kind of practices and work, particularly learning to go within and concentrate and experience directly your subtle energy. Then you can connect to spirit beyond really this world. Spirit is everywhere. Spirit has created everything and is beyond everything. And so we can find it. But it's much easier to do if we have a body that we begin with has higher level of, we can raise our frequency, it's just more work. But if we are lucky enough to come into an age with a higher level of frequency, it'll be even easier to connect to spirit.
So we brought up this idea of crystal radios and the attunement of its location with specific frequency. One of the things you bring up in the book is how the Great Pyramids of Giza, at the height of Satya Yuga, would have been in direct alignment with Orion's belt, if I remember correctly.
Yes, that's actually not a theory of mine per se, but has been described by other sort of new archaeologists who believe in a different past than the mainstream archaeologists do, that the three main pyramids on the Giza Plateau to the three stars in Orion's belt, and that there's a supposition that therefore there's some important connection perceived at the time when the pyramids were built between us and that area of space.
It just comes up for me, which I think is really interesting, is because they are made of granite, which is crystalline in structure. And you brought up in the book the idea of there is some speculation of could they have been some sort of energy generator or be used for some sort of spiritual, mystical, energetic initiation. How interesting that you have these very large crystalline structures that, as you comment on, potentially could resonate with the frequency of the earth in alignment with a position that heightens or is deeply connected to heightened spiritual attunement that potentially was a space for achieving even greater states of awareness.
There are, as you can imagine, hundreds of theories about how the Great Pyramids were built, why they were built, what they could have accomplished. Everything from the very mundane that the Great Pyramid was actually a granary, that they used it to stick their grain in, their fall harvest in, and it would keep it until spring. The common one still today is that the Great Pyramids were built to be tombs for pharaohs, and that they reference the later aspects of Egyptian culture that led to the tombs like King Tut's tombs and Seti I and Ramses tombs, which were not in pyramids. They were burrowed into the earth. This was 1,500 years after the pyramids were built. Just because they were in Egypt doesn't necessarily mean that there was a unbroken tradition of thinking between those two times. And the fact is that there never were any pharaonic or otherwise artifacts found in any of the pyramids. And if you visit the pyramids, which I recommend, they're awesome, and you go into the pyramids, especially into the Great Pyramid, they don't look like tombs when you're inside them. They're really plain and unadorned. The 1,500 years later, they're painting these amazing hieroglyphs and telling the stories from the Egyptian Book of the Dead, and they have golden this and crystal that, and they're really elaborately beautiful. But the Great Pyramid isn't. There's no evidence that there was any bas-reliefs on the walls. There's no evidence there was anything painted on the walls. And the chambers in them are peculiar in many ways. The king's chamber, so-called because mainstream archaeologists immediately assumed that the highest chamber of 3 or 4 that exist must have been for the king, it must have been for the pharaoh. But you can't get in it without almost crawling through passage. So if they did want to make this, a wonderful place like the 1,500 year later tombs in the various necropoli across Egypt, those were very humanly accessible. They had doorways that were people-sized, and they obviously had ceilings that were the height of people. They were built for people to put stuff in and to bury people in. Where the Great Pyramid is really awkward for people. There's something called the Grand Gallery, which would be like a mountain climbing expedition to get up to the so-called King's Chamber. They've subsequently built a set of stairs that goes up this area, but they're just giant granite steps that are much bigger than the average person would ever be able to just easily get up. So there's a lot wrong with the tomb theory, and that has gotten sort of new archaeologists who are looking for other answers to all things ancient, including the Great Pyramid. And they began to wonder, as you alluded, to whether, because there are other hints that mankind as a whole back then knew about electricity and perhaps vibration, that perhaps the pyramids were built to focus or store energy. Everything from really low frequency vibrations, like those, there is I don't know at what frequency it vibrates, but the entire Earth has a net vibration. And it's been argued that the base of the pyramid just perfectly fits the wavelength of that kind of vibration, and that therefore it probably captured the Earth's vibration passively and then gradually stepped it up until they could send out of the peak of it some sort of higher vibration, like a microwave or similar. But there's no evidence of how any other parts of Egypt around those pyramids would have made use of microwaves. They would have had to have receivers, whether they were passive receivers or more like our modern receivers. And even if they had receivers, what did they do with that energy? How did they turn that into something that the average person could take advantage of? There's a lot of evidence by Christopher Dunn, who wrote the Giza Power Plant and other books speaking to advanced technology on the Giza Plateau. And there you have me as definitely a concurring mind, because not only was the pyramid built at unbelievable scale, it was built to an unbelievable precision. And that precision really, some places, many places, you only really need one to kind of be proof of the idea, but there are enough of them that they're everywhere, indicated that they had high-speed tools, that some of the major granite pieces that were littered around the pyramids, they looked like rejects that were incorporated into the pyramid. They have holes drilled through them that have a diameter of 2 or 3 inches, all the way through a block of granite, which is really hard, and they're perfectly smooth and perfectly round, and they're perfectly straight right through rock. There's no way you can do this with chisels. There's no way you can do this with acid. there's really no other way except high-speed circular tools that you can go through there with. So I think that the level of sophistication that the pyramids were built at could theoretically support this notion of them being energy concentrators or passive gatherers of energy and broadcast points of energy. But I just get lost in the what did they do with it once they concentrated it? How did they make use of it? For me, the other direction that you mentioned seems most likely. And the other direction is that this had something to do with working on human consciousness. So I find it more easy to believe that that is the purpose of the Great Pyramids, also because of my belief in the Yugas. So for those who are skeptical, they may be shaking their head. You got to accept both. You got to accept the Yugas, which they may think is out there too far, and then you've got to accept this notion that the Great Pyramids were somehow involved in increasing human consciousness. But if you do accept the Yugas, what you have a picture of is that just 100 or 200 years before the Great Pyramids were built, mankind as a whole was in Treta Yuga. And they had mental powers. They could communicate telepathically. They could manifest things directly with the power of their minds. So if that's the case, as I believe it to be, all of the cultural understanding that came down to the Egyptians at that time would have been based on mental and spiritual powers. And they also would have known, because they knew about the Yugas. I know this is ifs on ifs on ifs, but I've just got to roll with what I think all adds up to making the most sense.
Roll with it.
Then if I knew I was going into Dwapara Yuga and we were losing these mental powers and we were losing touch with a higher spiritual age, but yet we were still highly advanced mentally, then that suggests to me if they were going to go to the trouble of building something so huge and so precise, that they would do it to try to maintain as long as possible some level of that consciousness that existed before them. Now, there's a lot of descriptions by psychics. There's no historians, there's no archaeologists, there's no papyri or hieroglyphics that support this. It's mainly psychics, one of whom is Elizabeth Heitch, whose description of the purpose and the life around the Great Pyramids fascinates me. She said that the entire Giza Plateau was an initiation school and that people would come there even at young ages and they'd train there and they'd learn essentially universal spirituality, but they'd learn to meditate, they'd learn to control their life force, and they'd gradually get stronger and stronger within themselves until they were ready to go have an intense experience of rapid acceleration of their spiritual growth that could only happen in one of the pyramids. So one of the things that always fascinates me, I love this image, is that when the Great Pyramids were built, they were covered in white limestone and they were perfectly smooth on their sides. And the joins between the various limestone blocks that clad the outside of the pyramid were really finely jointed. You can't get paper in between them. So you have this white pyramid that's like 30 stories tall and perfectly smooth, perfectly white. What Elizabeth Heitch and other psychics say is that this was not necessarily to make them beautiful, but that limestone acts as an insulator and that it kept whatever energies were being concentrated inside the pyramid, kept it in the pyramid. And Heitch described there being spiritual masters who were in the pyramids and who kept the pyramids charged at very high levels of subtle spiritual energy. And when the initiates were ready, they would come in, they'd have these experiences in various chambers, and it would accelerate their own spiritual growth. Now that makes my kind of sense. It doesn't make archaeological sense necessarily, but it makes my kind of sense for why the pyramids were built and why so much energy that it would have taken to build the pyramids was lavished on their creation. Because as a society, they didn't want to lose what they had in the past. And they were close enough to it to know how much higher the consciousness was in Treta Yuga. Sure. And they wanted to maintain it as long as they could. This was also the time when most of the people who were in these initiate schools were what you might consider members of the royal family, because the royal family at that time were people who had high consciousness, not the other way around. They didn't start off with low consciousness and just happened to be born into family of the pharaoh and end up being rulers. They were pharaohs because they had high consciousness, and that the whole notion of the divine right of kings and the high consciousness of royalty was really, if not begun with that period of the pyramids, but certainly kept alive and added to the tradition that followed.
It's hard for us in the society we live in to imagine so much time and resources being put to something quote unquote spiritual, because we live in such a capitalist society and such a materialistic society. Even on the planet at this time, if you study the culture of Tibet, so much of Tibetan culture is geared towards spiritual development, that they don't place the same level on material success as being the driver of society as we do in the West. So I think it's a hard thing for us to understand, but there are examples of places and people who say, no, our true wealth isn't what's here, it's what's coming down from above.
Well, I also want to just throw in, before we move too far from the point you made, I think it was also pragmatic. So it's possible in my world of how I think about it, that the people who had only a couple of hundred years ago been living in Treta Yuga, that there was still a good percentage of them that maintained the kind of powers that they had. And one of those powers could have been levitation. They could have built the Great Pyramid, even shaped the blocks in the Great Pyramid with these kind of powers. If you lived in that society, you would say, we need these people around. We need these men and women who can continue to guide us, yes, but also practical in a pragmatic way to build and to pass on that knowledge. So it's not entirely altruistic.
And I think we see examples of that even in Patanjali's Yoga Sutras about using meditative focus to cultivate abilities that quote unquote defy the laws of physics.
Yeah.
So it definitely is not a big leap to say that, do we as humans have the potential to develop our mental abilities so keenly that we can actually use that to affect physical reality to the point of moving, transporting, cutting, manufacturing items like stone blocks, creating buildings? In your book, you talk about the story of, I believe it's with Ram, who's considered an incarnation of Vishnu, of calling up a landmass to create a bridge to travel to Lanka. That recently there have been found in the ocean a landmass that cannot be explained by typical geological forces. So who knows, that may be in our future, it may be in our past. And one of the things you bring up in the book, in that third age, one of the qualities is time annihilation, that people who live in that age have the ability to see backwards and forwards in time. You bring up the specific type of pundits who keep records of people who were born thousands of years after they were written, and it can name very specific things about where were they born, what careers are they following. Just incredible level of detail written 1,000 years prior, saying, hey, you John Smith from England in the year 2024, I have a story about you. Perhaps we will reach a point in our evolution where we will be able to know exactly how the pyramids were built, how all these amazing things occurred, and their purpose, because time will stop existing as a linear progression that we are caught in the flow of.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, there are many abilities that are innate to us that the saints and sages tell us are true, that are kind of just beyond most of our ability to believe. But we are incredibly powerful beings. We have very little idea of who we really are. An entire society of people for whom that kind of knowledge and ability exists, would just be a completely different world.
Very simply, something I remember talking about with a dear friend of mine recently is how when we have dreams of flying, how incredibly familiar it feels. That idea of like, if I could just remember exactly what to do in the waking world, I could do it because it just feels so right. It feels so familiar. Perhaps that is a past life memory thing. Perhaps that is saying there have been times in my previous human incarnations where flying, everybody flew. That was a thing we just all did. That's why when we experience it in our sleep, we're like, oh yeah, that's That's part of me. Is there anything else you wanted to touch on in this conversation today?
Well, I want to be sure to get a plug in here. October 18th and 19th, there is a conference being held where I live, Ananda Village in Northern California, that is focusing on the higher ages of the Yugas. And it'll have myself as a speaker, Freddie Silva, who's written a lot about the ancient past, Robert Schoch, who's probably most famous for redating the Sphinx as being many, many thousands of years earlier than it's believed by mainstream archaeology, and a number of other experts in the ancient past. You can find out more about it at the CPAC conference site, the Conference on Precession and Ancient Knowledge, CPAC. Highly recommend it. You can come in person to the conference, which is always a lot of fun. You get to experience Ananda Village as well as the conference itself, but it'll also be online if you're interested. So October 18, 19 of this year, 2024. I have a new book out that just came out in the last week or two, which is The Physics of Miraculous Healing. I wrote The Physics of God, which got me deeply into physics, from understanding what classical physics is and the difference between that and quantum physics and string theory and M theory, and how these frontier disciplines of physics actually tie into spiritual truths much better than does the sort of more material view that is given to us by classical physics. So I took foundation of that and I looked into the phenomenon of miraculous healing. So there's a great deal of evidence that people have been healed instantaneously of serious illnesses. And according to modern medicine, that's impossible. And it's considered to be impossible because they think of the human body as being made of molecules and atoms. And molecules and atoms simply can't change that fast. But if you look to physics, the ones I just mentioned, the more subtle energy-based disciplines of physics, most especially including M theory, you begin to see that there is real scientific support for how physical objects, including your body, could change instantaneously. And then I take that and I get into how primarily emotion, our deeply held beliefs, and the ability to connect to spirit that enables us to, as individuals, enable subtle change, to actually make it happen in our own life for our own health or overcoming our own illnesses and perhaps accidents, that it's in our wheelhouse, that these are our soul powers. These are innate to us. And the more aware we become of them, the more able we are to use them for our own health. So there's that two sides. There's why physics makes it possible, and then there's how to actually put it to work in your own life. One of the people who endorsed my book came up with a line that I just can't beat. She said, Louise Hay told us we can heal ourselves. Joseph Selbie made me believe it was possible. So I'll rest at that.
Well, I know it's up next on my reading list now. And something you brought up in, I believe, The Physics of God and the book on the Yugas is studies with people who have what is commonly referred to as multiple personality disorder.
Yes.
One person will have a histamine response in their body to an allergen, and their other personality will not. There was a recorded instance of somebody's eye color changing or moles disappearing when personality switched in their body, scars disappearing. And so I think that provides a very interesting and captivating example of how our reality is not as concrete as we think it is.
And that the innate powers of our soul, which those different personalities in that one body are unquestioningly using, bring about instantaneous change. Because their beliefs about their version of this body that fits their memories and their personality is instantly affected by what they deeply believe to be the characteristics of that body. The most amazing story in that vein of multiple personality sufferers is about a woman who had 10 personalities to be treated by a psychiatrist in Germany. And when she came, she was completely blind. But through therapy, she began to be able to see, to a greater and lesser degree, 9 of her personalities, but remained blind in the 10th. Now, think of this scenario. She's in, let's say, personality number 9, who can see vaguely, moves into personality 10, that is completely blind, and then moves into personality 7, who can see again. And these are deep physiological changes that would have to take place in just moments to minutes. And they did evoked potential tests, visual evoked potentials tests on her, which was a fancy way of saying they rigged her up so they could observe brain activity and then shined a really bright light in her eyes. And when she was in personality 10, there was absolutely no response in the visual cortex in the back of her brain. This is impossible to fake. This is not her pretending to be blind for some emotional reason that she has. She is physiologically blind. And then the next personality that comes in isn't. So if you don't think you're powerful, think again.
That's wonderful. Last question. For those of us living in the time of Dwapara Yuga, and they're feeling frustrated by the lack of empathy, kindness, awareness, ability to sense that we are all connected, that we are all one, and feel frustrated with the state of humanity, what words of encouragement or wisdom do you have for them to say, make the most of this time while you're here?
I sort of alluded to it earlier. I think all of us are where we are for a reason. I believe in reincarnation, but even if you don't believe in reincarnation, it's a good exercise in positivity to say to yourself, I'm here. Why am I here? What can I do with where I am now? How can I grow into happiness, peace, love that is beyond what the world around me is capable of giving me or even stimulating in me? And I think the most effective answer is to learn to meditate. Now, everybody says you should meditate, right? It's being said so much now that I think people's eyes glaze over who don't meditate. And it's like, oh, okay, everybody talks about meditation. But the way I like to describe it, rather than saying you should meditate, is that through meditation, you should connect to spirit and you should connect to the higher powers that are innate to you. And then in and of themselves, they'll make you feel much happier, much more peaceful, much more compassionate and loving. But by doing so, and by you interacting with people in the world from that higher state, you will change the world. Gandhi put it well. Be the change you want to see in the world. Does two things: changes the world and it changes you. Makes you happy, makes others happy. And embrace it. This world is going to be transformed into the golden age in our lifetimes. It just isn't. But we can do our bit to move it along. And in the process, we can have wonderful, deep, powerful experiences of joy and happiness and love and be negatively unaffected by the world that is not such a great place around us.
Beautifully said. Joseph Selbie, everyone, thank you so much for your wisdom, your insight, your time, your heart, your beautiful writing and research. I can't even imagine how long it's taken for you to just even draft up the source material for the books that you've been creating. But I'm grateful that you've put in that time and energy because we are all better for it.
A privilege that I get to write on these subjects, which are me so important, but I get to write on them in such a way that they help other people. So I'm honored.
Beautiful. All right, so links are in the description. Please check it out. Go support his new book. Go attend a conference virtually or in person. And thank you for taking the time to engage. Love and blessings to you all.